sound of splintering wood rang through the grand dining hall as the heavy oak beams gave way under Charleston's worst rainfall in decades. William Barrett had barely enough time to glance up from his brandy before tons of timber and slate collapsed, crushing him beneath the ceiling he once flaunted as his masterpiece. But this was no act of God. This was revenge, 15 years in the making, carried out by the one man Barrett trusted most with hammer and nail. Moses Carter had spent months loosening joints, shaving supports, and weakening every connection that held the ceiling in place, waiting for the storm to deliver the final strike in a debt paid back with blood and bondage. To understand how this night came to be, we have to go back to 1818, when Moses Carter first set foot on Barrett's plantation. He was just 22, his massive hands hardened by years of shaping wood, his eyes carrying secrets that would take decades to surface. Barrett had purchased him for her $800 at the Charleston slave market, not for his back like most men, but for his rare gift. Moses could read the grain of wood like scripture. He seemed to know how trees wanted to be carved, coaxing beauty from even the most stubborn lumber. He could build furniture meant to last for generations, houses that stood firm against hurricanes, and he could do it all faster and finer than any carpenter in Charleston. Barrett put that gift to use immediately, building a mansion on Meeting Street that towered as a symbol of Southern wealth, its massive columns and vast rooms designed to impress Charleston's elite. After his wife Eleanor died, giving birth to a stillborn son in 1825, Barrett became obsessed with expanding the mansion, as if filling the house with new rooms could silence the emptiness that haunted its halls. Moses was forced to bring Barrett's grief-born ambitions to life, shaping additions that displayed his master's power. The breakfast room, with its hand-carved paneling, the library with its towering ceiling, the grand staircase that curved like a living thing. Every inch bore Moses's touch, but none carried his name. Though Barrett favored Moses over other enslaved men, allowing him to sleep in the carriage house, eat better food, even keep a sliver of the money earned when hired out, he was still property. Every dawn began with Barrett's voice calling his name, every day spent turning his genius into monuments for another man's pride. The breaking point came in the winter of 1831 with Barrett's most ambitious idea, yet a massive dining hall that would become the jewel of Charleston's social scene. Moses himself selected the century-old oak beams meant to support the vaulted ceiling. Barrett even walked the site with him, gesturing proudly as he described the feasts and gatherings that would cement his place among Charleston's elite. For Moses, the irony was bitter. His craftsmanship would raise the very room that years later would also serve as Barrett's tomb. Barrett's hand rested heavy on Moses's shoulder as he spoke with the tone of a man giving praise, but never granting respect. "This will be your masterpiece, Moses. When people see this room, they'll know William Barrett owns the finest carpenter in South Carolina." That word "owns" clung to the air like smoke from a fire that refused to die out. Moses gave the polite nod expected of him, but something inside shifted. For years he had buried the weight of being seen as a tool, a possession no different from Barrett's horses, his silver, or his imported china. In that moment, the weight became unbearable. When construction began in the spring of 1832, Moses poured every ounce of his skill into the dining hall. He handpicked the beams, inspected every joint, and designed the complex lattice of supports that would hold the massive ceiling aloft. To others, it looked like obsession, a craftsman chasing perfection. What they could not see was the deeper design hidden beneath the visible one, a plan that would take over a year to quietly execute. Moses used subtle changes in technique that only a master builder could recognize. Joints that should have been reinforced with wedges were held with dowels alone. Beams that ought to have been anchored firmly into the walls were instead routed through secondary supports that could be weakened later without leaving a trace. Every adjustment was invisible to Barrett's occasional inspections, hidden in places his master's eye would never wander. By the fall of 1832, the hall was complete. Barrett called it the finest room in Charleston, and it was hard to argue. The ceiling rose 20 feet above the polished pine floors, the oak beams gleaming with the illusion of strength. French crystal chandeliers shimmered across walls adorned with elegance, and in the center sat a massive table carved by Moses himself from the trunk of a single cypress tree. On Christmas Eve that year, Charleston's elite dined beneath Moses's secret design, raising glasses to Barrett's wealth, never imagining the ceiling over their heads was a carefully primed trap. From the kitchen doorway, Moses listened to their admiration. He understood the irony well. These same people would one day gather in mourning, standing under the very beams, destined to crush their host. The following months tested Moses's patience and precision. The second phase of his plan unfolded in silence, under the guise of maintenance. He introduced small amounts of water to key joints, swelling the wood just enough to loosen the fit with each cycle of drying. He filed down metal brackets until they clung together by friction alone. In hidden places, he hollowed beams so they looked solid, yet carried far less strength than they should. The work demanded balance too much, and the roof would fall before he was ready. Too little, and it might never fall at all. Timing was everything. Fortunately, Barrett was predictable. Each night after supper, he settled into the grand dining hall with a bottle of French brandy and his account books, spreading his papers across the enormous cypress table. And each night, without knowing it, he sat beneath a ceiling designed by his most trusted carpenter to one day become his coffin. Barrett always sat in the same chair night after night, directly beneath the largest beam in the dining hall, the very one Moses had weakened with the greatest care. Barrett claimed the solitude helped him think, but Moses knew better. It was about control, about surrounding himself with the wealth and power he believed defined him. In the summer of 1833, Charleston was drowning under relentless afternoon storms. For most, the rain was a nuisance. For Moses, it was the final piece of his design. The constant moisture caused the wood to swell and contract, stressing the joints he had already compromised. The ceiling was primed for failure. All that remained was for Moses to time his escape. In early August, he began quietly liquidating the small collection of possessions he had accumulated: tools, trinkets, scraps of metal, turning them into coins he could carry without suspicion. He memorized the schedules of departing ships, especially those bound for Caribbean ports, where his skills could earn him a living far from the reach of Charleston's authorities. He calculated that once Barrett's body was found, the alarm would spread quickly. His window to vanish would be no more than 6 hours. On the evening of August 15th, 1833, everything was ready. Rain swept across the city in heavy sheets, thunder rolling in the distance, exactly the kind of weather Moses had been waiting for. That afternoon, under the guise of routine checks, he made his final adjustments, loosening the joints just enough so they would not give way until Barrett was seated beneath them. At 7 o'clock, supper was served. At 8:30, as always, Barrett retired to the dining hall with his French brandy and his account books. By 9, he was settled into his favorite chair beneath the doomed beam lost in his numbers. Moses waited in the carriage house, listening as the storm built overhead. When the first drops hit the roof, he moved quietly toward the main house. Avoiding the boards he knew would creak the doors that always groaned on their hinges. From the garden, he could see Barrett through the glowing windows, hunched over his papers. A man wrapped in symbols of wealth built on the backs of enslaved people, unaware that the very ceiling above him had been turned into a weapon. Moses stayed hidden in the shadows, his eyes trained on the beams. The oak groaned under the strain, almost imperceptible beneath the pounding rain. But Moses's ear caught every subtle shift. The structure was seconds away from collapse. At 10:47, the first joint snapped with a crack sharp as gunfire. Barrett looked up startled as dust trickled down from the ceiling. A second joint failed, then a third. In an instant, the entire framework gave way in a roaring cascade. The massive central beam, Moses's masterpiece of sabotage, dropped first, crushing Barrett across the shoulders and driving him face first into the great cypress table. The brandy bottle shattered glass and liquid scattering across papers that would never be finished. In that moment, the house that Barrett had forced Moses to build became the tomb that ended his reign. The final collapse came swift and merciless. Barrett never even managed to cry before the remaining beams gave way, crashing down in a furious symphony of splintering oak and pine that buried him beneath nearly 2 tons of wreckage. In less than 10 seconds, the proud dining hall was reduced to rubble. Moses stood in the storm's shadows, his eyes fixed on the mound of shattered timber and plaster. He waited, listening unmoving for any sign of struggle from beneath the ruin. When none came, he knew the house had claimed its master. Without haste, without hesitation, he turned from the smoldering ruin of Barrett's empire and walked the muddy road toward Charleston's harbor. The storm cloaked him perfectly, driving every sensible soul indoors and leaving the streets deserted. He knew the city like the back of his calloused hands, every alley, every hidden cut-through, and he slipped through them unseen until the smell of salt air led him to the docks. Waiting there was the ship he had chosen, the Freedom's Dawn, bound for Port-au-Prince. The captain was a man who asked few questions so long as the fare was paid in silver, and Moses had been careful to prepare. By sunrise, as Charleston's skyline faded in the growing light, Moses stood on the deck of the vessel, the city of his bondage shrinking to a memory he would never allow to pull him back. The other passengers scarcely noticed him, a quiet black man who kept to himself in a cramped cabin. News of Barrett's death had not yet reached the harbor, and so Moses's escape unfolded in silence. He expected relief, maybe even joy, but what washed over him was exhaustion. 15 years of labor and anger pressed into his bones. Over the 6-day voyage, he began the slow work of remaking himself. Moses Carter, the enslaved carpenter of Charleston, ceased to exist. In his place rose Matthew Freeman, a craftsman free to chart his own course. He chose the name with care, Matthew for the apostle who left behind his old life to embrace a new calling. Freeman for the truth he had earned with his hands and his patience. Haiti welcomed him in a way America never had. Though still scarred from the revolution that had ended slavery decades earlier, Port-au-Prince was alive with rebuilding and men of skill were in demand. Within a week, Matthew was helping repair churches and schools damaged by earthquakes. For the first time, his labor created not monuments to arrogance, but spaces for community. Pride returned to his work, and soon his reputation spread. In less than a year, he was one of the most sought-after builders in the capital. Yet freedom came with burdens he had not anticipated. At night, dreams dragged him back to the dining hall, to the moment of collapse, to Barrett's crushed body beneath the beams. It wasn't regret he never doubted the justice of his actions, but a lingering weight that freedom could not lift. News from Charleston trickled across the sea by merchant captains. Barrett's death had been declared an accident, blamed on flawed construction and weeks of heavy rain. Investigators found no reason to suspect otherwise. Moses's disappearance was noted, but barely pursued. A few rewards were posted, but the descriptions were vague, and with Barrett's estate drowning in debt, few had interest in chasing down a single runaway slave. The plantation was sold off its land carved among buyers. The remaining enslaved men and women were auctioned, scattered to new masters, their lives altered, but still shackled. Charleston moved on, chalking Barrett's death up to misfortune. Only Moses knew the truth, that the fall of that house had not been chance, but design. And though he had left it behind forever, the memory of that night would follow him into his hard-won freedom. As the years passed, Moses became more than just a free man. He became part of Haiti itself. He married Celeste, a warm-hearted woman who ran a bakery near the harbor, and together they raised 2 children who would grow up never knowing the chains that had bound their father. The house they lived in was one Moses had built with his own hands, standing on land. He owned a simple fact that still felt miraculous to him, even decades after his escape. His carpentry business thrived as Haiti slowly rebuilt from years of war and turmoil, and his workshop became a hub for apprentices eager to learn from him. He didn't just teach them how to shape wood, he taught them the deeper lesson of pride in one's own labor of working for yourself, instead of enriching another man. For the first time in his life, his skills created not monuments to power, but structures for community. Still, the shadows of Charleston never completely left him. At night, he sometimes wondered about the men and women he had left behind, questioning whether his escape had cost them more suffering. When he could, he sent money through trusted intermediaries, anonymous gifts that helped buy freedom for others or supported families left in bondage. Meanwhile, back in Charleston, the dining hall where Barrett had met his end remained untouched. The new owners sealed it off rather than pay to clear the ruins. Children whispered it was haunted, and adults crossed themselves as they passed the boarded-up windows. But Moses knew there were no ghosts in that room, only the echoes of choices born from desperation. In 1848, 15 years after his escape, news reached him that South Carolina had passed laws making it easier for free black people to buy the freedom of enslaved relatives. Moses poured nearly all his savings into purchasing the freedom of 3 souls he had known on Barrett's plantation. He brought them to Haiti, where each found their own way. One became a teacher, another a merchant, and the third followed him into carpentry, learning not just the craft, but the dignity of working for oneself. For Moses, it was a kind of closure he hadn't known. He needed proof that his escape hadn't been only for himself. As he grew older, his life turned into legend. Haitian families told stories of the carpenter who outwitted his master with patience and precision, who turned oppression into liberation. The details blurred and grew more dramatic with each retelling. But the core truth never changed. Freedom was worth any price, and justice sometimes had to be taken, not given. Moses lived to see slavery abolished in the United States, though he never again set foot on American soil. He died in 1872 at the age of 76, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had known nothing but freedom. Their very existence was his greatest legacy. Back in Charleston, the ruins of Barrett's mansion lingered for decades until the site was finally cleared in 1885. When workers pulled down the last of the wreckage, they found what had remained hidden for 50 years. Barrett's bones still trapped beneath the central beam, his account books crumbling beside him, and the shattered glass of his final bottle of brandy. For a moment, the city buzzed with curiosity, but the official record still named it an accident, and Moses Carter remained a forgotten name in the property logs, just another escaped slave, whose fate was never known. What those men clearing the rubble could not see was the truth etched into every timber of that fallen ceiling. Each beam had been shaped as an act of rebellion, every joint a quiet declaration that ownership of another human being was a house destined to collapse. Moses had built his freedom into the very bones of Barrett's pride, and when the time came, he brought it all crashing down with the mastery of a craftsman who knew that sometimes the most beautiful thing you can build is the path to your own escape. The true legacy of Moses Carter was never the mansion he built for William Barrett or the grand dining hall that became his master's tomb. It lived in Haiti, in the children who grew up free under his roof, in the lives of former slaves, whose liberty he quietly purchased, and in the enduring lesson that intelligence and patience could topple even the strongest chains. He had shown that, though a man might be enslaved in body, his spirit could remain unbroken, and that with time and resolve, even the most powerless could carve out their own liberation. In the workshops of Port-au-Prince, master carpenters still told his story, the enslaved builder who hid his freedom in a ceiling and brought down his master's house beam by beam. They passed it on to apprentices, not just as a tale of craft, but as a lesson that every tool in the right hands could become an instrument of justice. The ring of hammers and the rasp of saws carried echoes of that stormy Charleston night, when Moses chose freedom over comfort, justice over safety, and a life lived on his own terms over submission. But Moses' story did not end with his escape. The ripples of that August night spread farther than he could ever have imagined. In 1851, nearly 2 decades after his disappearance, a young journalist named Jacob Richardson came to Charleston. He was researching Southern architecture for the Atlantic Monthly. But what intrigued him most were the whispered stories about the Barrett Mansion on Meeting Street, the so-called haunted house, where a grand dining hall had collapsed without warning. His questions led him to Marcus Whitmore Barrett's former overseer. Whitmore was 73 by then, a man worn thin by years of bad health and worse investments. He lived modestly, a far cry from the authority he had once wielded. Perhaps it was money, or perhaps the burden of secrets carried too long, but he agreed to meet Richardson at a tavern by the waterfront. The place smelled of smoke salt and whiskey, and Whitmore's voice was raspy when he finally spoke. "You want to know about Moses Carter?" he asked before Richardson had even finished explaining his research. "Everybody who comes asking about that house eventually does. Most believe he was just another runaway, a slave who slipped away when his master died. But I knew Moses better than anyone, except Barrett himself. And I can tell you there was more to that man than people realized." Richardson leaned forward, notebook open, sensing the story shifting beneath his feet, from an architectural survey into something far more consequential. Whitmore's clouded eyes stared past the tavern walls, past the crowded room, back to the plantation of his youth. "Moses came to us when he was barely a man," Whitmore said. "But his hands could make wood sing. Barrett paid $800 for him, a fortune for a slave back then. But Moses was worth every cent and more. He could look at a tree still standing in the forest and tell you what it wanted to be. Could design furniture in his head that other men would spend weeks sketching out. He had a gift." Whitmore's hand trembled slightly as he lifted his glass. After a swallow of whiskey, he added quietly, "But there was something about him that made me uneasy. He was always watching, always remembering. Thought deeper than most white men I ever knew. Barrett gave him privileges, better food, better quarters, even wages now and then. But I could see in Moses's eyes that he knew privileges weren't freedom. And that difference, it mattered." The old overseer leaned closer across the scarred tavern table, his voice dropping low despite the din around them, as if confessing something dangerous. Something he had never dared say aloud before. "The night that ceiling came down, I was in my cottage about a quarter mile from the big house." Whitmore said, his voice low, his eyes distant. "Heard the crash as loud as thunder. I knew right then something terrible had happened. By the time I reached the dining hall, it was chaos, dust, rubble, Barrett buried beneath it all. But Moses, he was gone. His bed hadn't been slept in, his few belongings gone, not a trace of him left on the property." Richardson's pen scratched across the page, catching every word, every flicker of emotion on the old overseer's weathered face. "Do you believe Moses's disappearance was just coincidence with the collapse?" he asked carefully. Whitmore didn't answer at first. He stared into his whiskey as though searching for answers in its amber depths. Finally, he spoke. I've had near 20 years to think on that night. And I can tell you this, Moses didn't just escape when the ceiling fell. Moses made that ceiling fall. The pen froze in Richardson's hand. You mean to say you believe he caused the collapse? That it wasn't an accident? Whitmore's gaze lifted steady now despite the tremor in his hands. Moses Carter was the finest carpenter in South Carolina. If anyone could design a ceiling to come down at the exact moment he wanted, it was him. After we pulled Barrett's body out, I looked at the wreckage myself. And what I saw, it wasn't natural. The beams had been tampered with, weakened in places no inspector would ever look. Joints compromised in a way that guaranteed failure, but only after time and strain did their work. It was no accident. It was intent. Richardson felt his pulse quicken. The implications staggered him. If Whitmore was right, this was not simply an escape, but one of the most deliberate, sophisticated acts of resistance ever carried out by an enslaved person. The planning, the knowledge required, the patience to set it in motion, he whispered. Whitmore nodded. Moses was extraordinary. Could have been an architect, an engineer if he'd been born white. Instead, he was shackled to a system that prized him only as a tool. Barrett thought giving him privileges made a difference, but it didn't. Owning another man, no matter how kindly you dress it up, is still ownership. Spurred by Whitmore's words, Richardson dug deeper. He searched plantation records stored in Charleston's Historical Society harbor ship manifests and letters exchanged between Barrett and his peers. Piece by piece, a clearer portrait of Moses emerged, a man celebrated across the region for his craftsmanship, yet barred by law from ever claiming the rewards of his own genius. The evidence mounted. Technical sketches in Moses's own hand revealed a grasp of structural engineering ahead of his time. Precise calculations proving his mathematical mastery. Barrett's letters boasted of Moses's uncanny ability to foresee when a building would falter, an invaluable gift for someone who might want to ensure such failures happened on schedule. And then Richardson uncovered something darker. In Savannah, the ruins of a warehouse that had collapsed in 1830, killing its owner. A man notorious for cheating his workers bore traces of Moses's handiwork. In Columbia, records mentioned a church that had burned mysteriously in 1820, not long after Moses had worked on its rafters. These weren't coincidences. They suggested a pattern. A hidden record of resistance and retribution, written not in words, but in collapsing walls and fallen beams. Richardson set his pen down, realizing his architectural survey had transformed into something far more dangerous. The untold story of a man who had turned his master's tools into weapons, who had built freedom not just with wood and nails, but with patience, intellect, and a quiet, unshakable will. The trail of evidence Richardson uncovered pointed to something much larger than a single collapse in Charleston. In Savannah, he found records of a warehouse that had crumbled in 1830, killing its owner, a man infamous for cheating laborers of their wages. In Columbia, whispers of a church fire from 1820 linked back to the time when Moses had been loaned out to work on its rafters. And in yet another case, parish records had vanished in a mysterious blaze that destroyed the office of a pastor known for betraying those who aided freedom seekers. Each incident, when viewed in isolation, looked like misfortune, but stitched together, they revealed a subtle and deliberate campaign of retribution. Each time someone cruel or unjust had been the target. Each time Moses had been nearby. The most damning evidence came not from Charleston, but from the harbor records in Savannah. Richardson discovered a ship's manifest for the Freedom's Dawn, which had sailed on August 16, 1833, just one day after Barrett's death. Listed among the passengers was a Matthew Freeman, a free man of color bound for Port-au-Prince to start a carpentry trade. The description matched Moses perfectly, and the timing was too exact to ignore. Letters to Haiti confirmed what Richardson suspected Matthew Freeman was, indeed Moses Carter reborn. In Port-au-Prince, Freeman was not only remembered as a master carpenter, but as a leader in the growing community of former American slaves. He had established a school where young men learned carpentry alongside literacy, and with the wealth he earned, he purchased the freedom of dozens still in bondage. But the most extraordinary discovery was that Freeman had left behind journals, meticulous accounts of his work, his philosophy, and his confessions. It took months of correspondence and negotiations, even payments, before Richardson gained access to these guarded documents. What he found surpassed even his expectations. In his own words, Moses detailed not only how he engineered Barrett's death, but also his broader campaign of what he called invisible warfare. These were acts of sabotage so carefully designed, they appeared as accidents of fate tools breaking in overseers' hands, slave quarters mysteriously better ventilated and insulated, small comforts engineered in secret for the enslaved, and flaws hidden in the works of cruel masters that would one day bring their wealth crashing down. More than once, Moses confessed his doubts. He wrote of sleepless nights, of the guilt that trailed him even into freedom, of the fear that his sabotage had invited harsher punishments for others. He wrestled with the morality of violence, but ultimately concluded that slavery itself was a violence so profound that resistance by any means was justified. What began as small acts of rebellion had grown into a network of enslaved craftsmen, quietly exchanging techniques, passing on tricks of subtle sabotage. What Moses called liberation through craftsmanship. For over a decade, this network spread across South Carolina and Georgia, an invisible brotherhood undermining slavery with every hammer stroke and chisel cut. When Richardson published his findings in the Atlantic Monthly in 1852, the story ignited a storm. Abolitionists hailed Moses Carter as a hero whose patience and intellect proved the enslaved had agency in shaping their destinies. Pro-slavery voices denounced him as a murderer, a saboteur, a traitor, who had turned his master's trust into a weapon. Among those who took notice was Frederick Douglass, who recognized in Moses' story a reflection of his own. Douglass wrote that Moses' tale was not just about vengeance, but about proof that enslaved people possess the brilliance and the will to resist. If slavery makes a man a beast, Douglass declared, then Moses Carter showed us that even beasts can build traps, and even the trapped can build their freedom. From that moment, Moses Carter's name lived not just in whispers of ghost stories in Charleston, but in the rhetoric of the abolitionist movement, where his ceiling of oak and pine became a symbol of what happens when patience, skill, and justice converge against oppression. Frederick Douglass captured the essence of Moses Carter's story when he wrote in Toss the North Star. Moses Carter did what the law would never do. He brought justice to a man who grew rich by denying freedom to others. He turned the very tools of bondage into the means of liberation, transforming the master's investment into his own escape. Those words gave Moses' story a permanence in the abolitionist imagination. He was no longer just a runaway slave or even a clever craftsman. He became a symbol proof that patience, intelligence, and skill could turn oppression inside out. In the United States, debates over his legacy intensified through the 1850s. Abolitionists pointed to his ingenuity as evidence of the humanity and brilliance of the enslaved, while defenders of slavery twisted his story into a cautionary tale, arguing that giving enslaved people education or skills only armed them with tools for rebellion. His name was invoked on both sides of the national divide, part of the growing storm that would lead to civil war. In Haiti, however, Matthew Freeman refused to step into the spotlight. The attention sparked by Richardson's articles and Douglas's praise made him briefly famous. But he declined interviews and public appearances, insisting his work spoke for itself. That work was remarkable. His carpentry school blossomed into a self-sustaining community, a place where dozens of young men learned not just how to plane boards and raise beams, but how to think of craftsmanship as liberation. His designs combined practicality with vision workshops and dormitories built to expand with the community's secret storage rooms that could hide runaways' hidden passages meant to shelter those fleeing from American ports. For Moses, architecture was never about grandeur. It was about serving people, keeping them safe, and giving them dignity. As tensions in America escalated, Moses's workshop became part of a wider network. Ships leaving southern ports carried hidden compartments of his design, smuggling fugitives to freedom in Haiti, Cuba, or beyond. His knowledge of construction and engineering proved invaluable. He could disguise a compartment so well that even inspectors wouldn't suspect it, and he could forge documents convincing enough to pass scrutiny. The irony was sharp. The same hands that once built Barrett's house of bondage now crafted freedom ships, and the same mind that had orchestrated a ceiling collapse now mapped escape routes that saved hundreds. When the Civil War broke out in 1861, Moses was already 65. His body bearing the toll of decades of hard labor. He did not return to the United States, but he gave what he could money to the Union cause tools and trained men. Many of his former students left Haiti to contribute as carpenters, engineers, and laborers for Union forces. The arrival of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 was marked in his workshop with a solemn gathering. He listened as the words were read aloud, surrounded by apprentices, freedmen, and families who had built lives around the community he created. It was a vindication, but also a reminder of how much had been lost while waiting for justice that came too late for so many. As the war dragged on, letters began to flow back to him. Former students and members of the Caribbean Freedom Network who had returned to the United States described the fragile beginnings of Reconstruction. They wrote of schools being raised where none had existed, churches that served as both sanctuaries and organizing halls, and the constant resistance they faced from whites unwilling to accept freedom's reality. They pleaded for guidance, for materials for teachers, and Moses, though too old to travel, poured what resources he could into their efforts. By then, his life had come full circle. The enslaved carpenter who once built monuments to another man's vanity had become the architect of freedom's foundation. His influence stretching from Haiti to America's struggling new communities. Where Barrett's dining hall once stood as a symbol of wealth and oppression, the sound of saws and hammers in Moses's Haitian workshops now echoed as a promise that liberation could be built beam by beam with patience and purpose. Though the pleas for Moses to return to America during Reconstruction were constant and heartfelt, he never wavered in his refusal. At nearly 70, he had earned peace, and more than that, he believed his duty remained with the Haitian community. He had built a living proof of what could be achieved when black people were free to develop their gifts without chains or fear. His final great undertaking was nothing less than monumental: the construction of a cathedral in Port-au-Prince. It took 5 years to raise its walls, a project that stretched both his skill and his imagination. The cathedral was more than stone and timber. It was a declaration. Its soaring spaces were designed not to intimidate, as Barrett's dining hall once had, but to inspire awe tempered with welcome. Light streamed naturally through carefully designed apertures, and the structure itself breathed with clever systems of ventilation innovations Moses had refined over decades. When it was dedicated in 1868, the cathedral became not just a place of worship, but a symbol of what free hands and free minds could create. Visitors came from across the Caribbean and even from the United States, where his legend had already entered abolitionist lore. Among those visitors was Frederick Douglass himself, finally meeting the man he had so often held up as an example. The two spent hours in deep conversation. "You chose the hardest path," Douglass told him, "but perhaps the most necessary. You proved we were never property, that our minds and souls belonged to us, even when the law claimed otherwise." Moses's reply showed the humility that had always defined him. "I had skills that gave me opportunities others did not. But every person who held on to dignity in slavery, who kept their families safe, who helped others when they could, they fought the same war I did. I just happened to have tools that could bring down a ceiling." That conversation, recorded by a journalist at the dedication, gave the world its most intimate glimpse into Moses's philosophy. Despite the fame that had grown around his story, he remained rooted in the practical. He spoke of sanitation and water systems, of how to design schools and workshops that could sustain free communities. He shared blueprints with younger architects and engineers, determined to pass on not just his knowledge of carpentry, but his belief that buildings should serve people, not oppress them. Moses Carter died in 1872, passing quietly in his sleep, surrounded by the family he had built over decades. His wife Celeste, his children and grandchildren, and countless refugees and freedmen he had welcomed into his orbit. His funeral was held inside the cathedral he had built, its vaulted ceilings echoing with hymns of both grief and triumph. Hundreds gathered, from local apprentices to merchants and teachers, to those who had once arrived in Haiti, broken and afraid only to find dignity in his community. The eulogy was delivered by David Laurent, one of Moses's very first students. David had come to Haiti as a terrified teenager smuggled out of Louisiana, and under Moses's guidance had grown into one of the island's most successful merchants. His voice broke as he spoke. "He gave me more than freedom. He gave me the tools to live free." In the end, Moses Carter's legacy was not the destruction of Barrett's Hall, nor even the cathedral that still stood in Port-au-Prince. It lived in the hands of those he had taught, in the families he had sheltered, and in the communities he had strengthened. Every plank, every beam, every building he touched carried the same lesson that freedom once built could endure. David Laurent's eulogy captured the essence of Moses Carter's life better than any tale of heroism or vengeance. He spoke not of a dramatic figure larger than life, but of a teacher who showed by example that freedom was not a single act, but a practice, something built day by day, choice by choice, like a structure designed to endure centuries. Moses taught us, Laurent said, that every hammer blow could be an act of liberation if we chose to make it so. He showed us that the same hands once forced to raise monuments to oppression could also build schools for our children, homes for our families, and churches where we could worship as free people. His greatest legacy is not the ceiling he brought down, but the community he lifted up. That legacy did not die with him. In the decades after his passing, Moses Carter's story became a touchstone for generations of craftsmen, architects, and engineers who saw in his life the proof that technical skills could be used as instruments of justice. Engineering schools that began admitting black students after the Civil War studied his methods, while his philosophy of building for liberation influenced a wave of community-centered architecture across the Americas. In the late 19th century, many of his former students carried the techniques honed in Haiti's freedom workshops back to the United States, where they contributed to the construction of historically black colleges and universities. Their buildings, filled with natural light designed for openness and community, reflected Moses's conviction that architecture should uplift those who used it. Booker T. Washington, when founding the Tuskegee Institute in 1881, cited Moses Carter as an inspiration. He praised Carter's example as proof that education must combine technical excellence with social purpose, shaping not only skilled laborers, but men and women capable of building entire communities. By the early 20th century, Moses' name was invoked by civil rights leaders and intellectuals. W.E.B. Du Bois placed him among the historical figures who embodied the talented 10th proof that black leadership could guide the race toward equality. Du Bois admired Carter's fusion of practical mastery and intellectual depth, a direct challenge to white supremacist myths about black inferiority. During the Harlem Renaissance, his story found new artistic life. Langston Hughes immortalized him in the poem The Carpenter's Revenge, recasting the collapse of Barrett's Hall as a parable of patient planning and quiet defiance. Claude McKay's novel, The Falling Beam, transformed that same event into a metaphor for the collapse of racial exploitation itself. His story echoed again during World War II. When black soldiers returning from Europe, men trained in technical trades by the military, saw in Moses Carter a forerunner of their own determination to use their skills to build stronger, freer communities at home. By the civil rights era of the 1950s and 1960s, Moses Carter was more than a historical figure, he was a symbol. His long, careful plan against Barrett stood as a lesson in patience and strategy, but also as a warning about what happens when people are denied lawful paths to justice. Martin Luther King Jr., speaking in Charleston in 1963, not far from the ruins of Barrett's mansion, invoked his name. Moses Carter waited 15 years to strike his blow for freedom. He reminds us both of the power of patience and the tragedy of a system that left him no choice but violence. Let us honor his intelligence, his skill, his vision. But let us also commit ourselves to building a world where freedom need not wait a generation and where justice can be won without destruction. From the moment the beams fell in Charleston to the marches of the civil rights era, Moses Carter's legacy endured not simply as the man who brought down a ceiling, but as the craftsman who taught the world how to build freedom. King's Charleston speech in 1963 placed Moses Carter at the center of a long tradition of patient, purposeful resistance. He used those years to perfect his plan, to develop his skills, and to prepare for the moment when he could act decisively. King told the crowd, "We must have that same patience and that same determination. But we must also ensure that people do not have to wait 15 years for justice." Many historians note that this address foreshadowed the cadence and themes of King's "I Have a Dream" speech at the March on Washington later that year, drawing parallels between past acts of courage and present demands for equality. As the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965 redefined the legal landscape of America, the memory of Moses Carter evolved too. Where earlier generations had emphasized the dramatic collapse of Barrett's dining hall, the later narrative shifted toward his legacy as an educator, a builder of communities, and a man who transformed oppression into opportunity. His name became shorthand for black intellectual achievement, strategic resistance, and the power of skilled labor to serve justice. This change reflected a broader cultural awakening. By the mid-20th century, American society was beginning to recognize that enslaved people were never passive victims, but agents of their own survival and resistance. Moses' story became part of that larger truth that black people had always fought back, whether through quiet sabotage, secret education, or the patient nurturing of families and communities under impossible conditions. By the 21st century, Moses Carter's life was studied not only as history, but as inspiration. His story appeared in architecture schools, where professors used it to show how design could either enforce oppression or uplift communities. Engineering programs used his journals to spark discussions about professional ethics, reminding students that technical knowledge always carries moral responsibility. Scholars re-examined the Charleston dining hall collapse with modern forensic tools and confirmed what Whitmore and Richardson had long suggested. The evidence bore the marks of deliberate engineering executed with precision far ahead of its time. That an enslaved carpenter had achieved such a feat without access to modern mathematics or structural modeling only heightened the respect for his genius. The complete publication of Moses Carter's journals deepened this respect. His writings showed a man who believed freedom meant little unless it was shared, and who saw his own resistance as part of a collective struggle. The journals revealed a sophisticated underground network of skilled enslaved people exchanging knowledge, sabotage methods, construction tricks to ease living conditions, strategies for teaching literacy in secret, and systems of mutual aid. This invisible brotherhood, as Moses called it, had stretched across the South for decades without being uncovered, a quiet revolution hiding in plain sight. The reach of Moses's influence grew clearer as historians traced the lines forward. His students and their descendants carried his techniques and ideals beyond Haiti and the United States, spreading them through the Caribbean, Latin America, and eventually into Black communities worldwide. Schools, workshops, and grassroots organizations that embraced his blend of technical training and social commitment sprang up in dozens of countries. In the end, Moses Carter's legacy was not simply the fall of a ceiling in Charleston. It was the rise of generations who understood that skill and knowledge, when wielded with patience and conviction, could reshape the world. He proved that freedom, like a building, must be crafted with care, strengthened with vision, and sustained through community, beam by beam, choice by choice. Today, Moses Carter is honored not only as the enslaved carpenter who brought down his master's ceiling, but as a teacher, innovator, and community builder whose influence reached far beyond that single dramatic act of resistance. His story is a testament to the many forms resistance can take, proof that intelligence, patience, and skill can be just as powerful as open defiance, and that the very tools once used to sustain oppression can be turned against it. In Port-au-Prince, the workshop Moses founded has endured and grown into a modern technical institute that serves students from across the Caribbean and beyond. While carpentry and traditional building methods remain at its core, the curriculum now includes engineering, sustainable design, and community planning, extensions of Moses's original belief that education and craftsmanship should uplift people, not just generate wealth. It is a living embodiment of his philosophy that knowledge must be tied to liberation. Back in Charleston, near the site where William Barrett's mansion once loomed over Meeting Street, a historical marker now stands. It does not celebrate the planter who amassed wealth on the backs of enslaved people, but instead commemorates the man he once owned, the carpenter whose patience and brilliance proved that no system of bondage could extinguish the human will for freedom. The marker acknowledges the violence of that August night in 1833, but frames it within the larger struggle for dignity and justice that continues to shape the world. Moses Carter's life reminds us that history is not made only by generals and politicians, but also by those who refuse to accept injustice as unchangeable. His hammer and saw became tools of liberation. His knowledge of wood and stone became weapons against tyranny, and his methodical planning became a model for anyone seeking to dismantle oppression with intelligence and resolve. Today, his legacy resonates in Haitian workshops, in American engineering schools, in community centers and institutes built by his students and their descendants. Every time a building rises that is meant to shelter rather than dominate. Every time knowledge is shared to empower rather than to exploit. And every time resistance is carried out with patience and purpose, the spirit of Moses Carter endures. The sound of hammers and saws still carries the echo of that Charleston night, when an enslaved man chose to bring down a ceiling, and in doing so struck at the foundations of a system built on human bondage. His life stands as a reminder that freedom, like a well-crafted structure, must be built deliberately, beam by beam, with skill, vision, and an unyielding belief in the dignity of all people.